everybody. So I'm going to talk to you guys about verbal de-escalation today. Those of you who have had CPI training will have likely heard all of this stuff before, but not everybody has. So hopefully this will serve as a good reminder for some of you, new information for some of you. But I think it's a skill that's very important in the work that we do, and a lot of our students will benefit from it once they start to go into that crisis mode. Hopefully today you'll learn some tools and strategies to help de-escalate a student or any individual who is in crisis mode. So the first thing that I want to talk to you guys about is the stages of crisis development. In CPI, they have this model in the nonviolent crisis intervention. They have a model that has 4 levels that an individual typically exhibits when they are going into a crisis mode. They call it the crisis development model. So in it, there are behaviors and then the approaches that we as staff should take when we recognize those behaviors. So the first level in the crisis development is anxiety. So an individual may exhibit anxiety, which they define as a change in behavior. So that could be anything. I just have some examples here. For example, they might put their head down, they might start pacing, they might start tapping. Some students might bite their nails. Some might get really quiet. Some might get really talkative. It is very individual, and it's a lot easier for us to recognize anxiety in students that we are familiar with and that we know well. So staff, when we recognize that there's been a change in behavior, whatever it is, our job is going to be supportive. So we're going to approach the student with an empathic and non-judgmental approach or way. So that might mean they may need time to listen. We may need to just give them some time. If they need to take a minute, they can go take a walk. Whatever that student needs in that time, we're going to provide to hopefully de-escalate the crisis at this point. So again, anxiety, that change in behavior, different for everybody. That second level of behavior escalation is defensive. So, the student's gone through anxiety. We've seen a change in behavior. They haven't de-escalated. Sometimes it's very quick. So they may move right from anxiety into defensive. They may move right into a defensive level. But what the defensive level looks like is beginning to lose rationality. That's when you might start to see that non-compliance, that student saying no, maybe they're shouting, maybe they're talking back, maybe they're questioning you. They're starting to lose that rationality. They're escalating. It may not make a lot of sense to us. But at this point, the staff is going to be directive. We're going to try to decelerate an escalating behavior. So in order to do that, we'll go over this in the next section because there is a whole continuum of different behaviors that happen just within this level. But we're going to be directive here. We're going to give very simple and clear directions. We're going to set limits. We're going to try to downplay and try to calm them down. Like I said, we'll get into this a little bit later. The third level of crisis development is risk behavior. You're not going to need to know how to address this. That's not what this training is about. If you want to learn that, we'll have to do the full CPI training. But just so you guys have an idea of what the crisis escalation typically looks like. So then after defensive, you may see some risk behavior, which is, behaviors that present a risk to the student or to other people. So that's, again, a wide array, but examples are, hitting, kicking, punching, scratching, biting, all the good stuff. And our approach at this point is physical intervention or deciding whether to use it or not. But this is the level where we may have to. So using those disengagement and holding procedures, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because you won't need to know that right now. And then the last level of the crisis development model is tension reduction. So that is a decrease in physical and emotional energy. So an individual in this level, you may see some crying. This is where you might see the apology. They may sit down, put their head down. They might be tired. This happens, after they've gone through all these other levels. So they're kind of coming down. And once we see that they're kind of coming down, our job now is to build a therapeutic rapport. So we're going to want to try to reestablish that communication, rebuild that trust, because sometimes crisis situations may break the trust between the student and whoever is addressing it. So again, here, we're going to listen to them. We're going to give them time. We're going to talk about kind of what happened, what they could have done differently. Is there something they could do better next time? And this step is really, really, really important, because if we don't address this, we have no way of knowing for sure if that crisis is done. And a lot of the times, tension reduction stage behaviors look a lot like the anxiety behavior. So we want to make sure that they truly are in that tension reduction stage and not back at the anxiety stage and going to start re-escalating altogether. This also allows us to kind of put an end to it and move forward. So as I said, that second level in there, that defensive mode where we're going to be directive, that has a whole continuum in and of itself. So those of you who have done CPI will be familiar with the kite. So that's what this is. It's that second level. So again, this is not linear. People don't necessarily go in this order. I'm going to talk about them in an escalating order, but it's not necessarily the way that we will see them in real time. But typically the first behavior that we see in a defensive level situation would be questioning. So at this stage, you might see students start to question, and there are two types of questions. There are information-seeking questions, and then there are challenging questions. So if you give a direction and the student says, what page am I supposed to be on? That is an information-seeking question. It's a legitimate question. We're going to give a rational response. That's all it is. It's just a rational question. We're giving a rational response, and that should end it. The next kind of question you might see is a challenging question. So, they're starting to try to want to get into that power struggle at this point. They might be more questions of, you can't make me do this. Why do I have to do it? Insert whatever your students might say. And our job here is going to be to downplay that challenge. We're going to start setting some limits and not get into that power struggle. So it's really important. These kids that want to get into that power struggle, we have to drop the rope. They're trying to get into that tug of war. Just drop the rope, move along, set your limits, and you should hopefully diffuse the situation. After the questioning, sometimes it escalates very quickly to refusal. Sometimes you just see a student in that defensive level that just starts refusing. Nope, not going to do it. I don't want to do it. They might put their head down. They might ignore you. Just flat out not want to do the work. So at this point, we're going to set limits. We're going to give very clear, simple directions and set those limits. There's a few different ways that we want to set the limits. We want to make sure that we can enforce whatever limit we do set. So 3 different ways that you can set limits. You can interrupt and redirect. So literally just interrupting the behavior and redirecting them to what you want them to do. So whether it's, Johnny, you're yelling, I need you to raise your hand, or, please don't call out, wait your turn, whatever it is, interrupt and redirect. The second way that you can do that is when and then. So you're going to give when you complete the task, then you get whatever. So when you do your math, then you get to play. When you read your chapter, then you can go to lunch, whatever it is. Just very simple. There's no emotion in it. It's very objective. It's when and then. And the third way that you can set limits is using an if and then. So in this, you're going to outline the consequence for the good wanted decision and the consequence for the worst decision or the bad choice. So you might say, if you do your math, then you get to go play. If you don't finish your math, you're going to have extra homework, or you're going to have to stay in for recess, or whatever it is. In this case, it's important to outline the positive outcome first, so that you keep their attention. If you start with the negative outcome first, then it they're already in that not so positive headspace. So making sure that they know what the good outcome will be if they choose to follow your direction will hopefully help them make that decision. Then you can just walk away, let them be, and let them make that decision. Again, drop the rope. Don't get into it with them. So then we might see individuals going into that release stage, which is a verbal and emotional outburst. They're losing rationalization here. They're not getting physical yet, but you might see some screaming, you might see some shouting. They may leave the room or attempt to leave the room. At this point here, we're going to allow venting. We're going to remove the audience if possible. So either remove the class or remove the individual if it's safe to do so. And be prepared to enforce those limits. If we say, if you don't do your math, you can't go to recess, we can't let them go to recess. We have to make sure that we're not making limits that we can't enforce. Okay, after that, you might see some intimidation, so verbally or non-verbally threatening staff. So again, they're not getting fully physical with staff, but they might make some motions like they're going to hit you. They might make some verbal threats. I hate you. I'm going to kill you. I know where you live, all those things. In those moments, it's important for us to take those threats seriously, especially if we don't know the student very well. There are some students that we know well. We know this is part of their repertoire. We know that they make threats. We know that they don't mean them, so we can address them in a certain way. But typically we want to take threats very seriously. We want to seek assistance at this point. You don't want to be alone with an individual who's in this stage. You want to make sure to cover yourself, that you have someone else in there as a witness, someone that can help jump in so that you're not addressing the situation by yourself. And try to avoid physical intervention at this point. Because again, they're not being physical yet, so we shouldn't have to intervene physically. Intervening physically with an individual in this stage might really escalate the situation. And lastly, in this defensive level, there is a tension reduction phase. So again, it's the same thing. It's that decrease in physical and emotional energy. So once they've gone through, all 4 or just 2, however many levels of that defensive behavior we've seen, they usually will come down into that tension reduction stage. So again, our approach here, we're going to rebuild that therapeutic rapport. We're going to listen to them. We're going to figure out what happened, what could happen next time, what could happen differently, but just give them time and rebuild that communication. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is nonverbal communication and the role that plays in de-escalating an individual in crisis. So as most of you probably know, 80% of our communication is nonverbal. So how we convey a message is 80% not words, basically. So within nonverbal communication, there's nonverbal and paraverbal, and we'll kind of go over the difference between the two of them. Nonverbal communication, there's 3 components to it, and it has more to do with how we move and use our body. But that first notion is the one of personal space and how close we allow people to get to us. And it's important to understand and realize that everybody has a different personal space bubble. So everyone has a different notion of what's comfortable for them, and that's important to recognize. And I just want you to think about how you would use personal space when handling somebody in a crisis. How might that look? How might that look different to if you're just going up to somebody that you haven't seen in a while? And just keeping in mind, again, that there are typically 3 different zones. So that there's that intimate zone that's really close to you. And the number of people that you let into that zone might be really, really small. It might just be, friends, very close friends and family. It may just be, your partner, your parents, your kids. And then typically there's the personal space, which is, close friends of ours, people that we know well, we may allow a little bit closer. And then there's that social bubble where it's kind of just everybody else, all those acquaintances, strangers, people we don't really know. We kind of want them to stay a little bit farther, typically. There are a lot of factors that influence how close we want somebody to us. So whether that's gender, culture, past experiences with a person. But the notion really to keep in mind is that everybody has a different comfort level. And when you are dealing with an individual or a student who is escalating or who is in a crisis, they may not want you close to them. They may not want you coming up to them from the front. You may have to approach them from the side. So really it's how close do you get to somebody in a crisis situation? The next part of nonverbal communication is body language. So how you use and move your body. So the gestures that you use, the stance, your movement. Are you going to be moving really quickly? Are you going to be super closed off? And how those would affect somebody in crisis. So if you're trying to de-escalate a situation, you're likely not going to be like coming up straight in front of them, pointing your finger. You're going to want to be aware of your body language and try to keep an open, relaxed stance and body language, and try to be supportive without saying anything. And then the next component of nonverbal communication is that communication through touch and how we use our bodies to communicate through touch. So whether that's a high five, whether it's a handshake, a pat on the back, we can communicate a lot through our touch. If you're grabbing onto someone and you're squeezing, that communicates something versus, rubbing somebody's back. So again, like how can we use all of these components to help de-escalate a situation? Different individuals will mean that we have to adjust our body language to try to help them. And if we're aware of what it looks like and what we want it to look like, we can help. So the next part of nonverbal communication is that paraverbal communication. So this is the vocal part of speech, excluding the words. So it's not what you say, but how you say it. And again, like I'm sure you've witnessed how the way you say a certain phrase can drastically change the meaning. So within this paraverbal communication, there's kind of three components. There's that tone, that volume, and cadence. And when dealing with an individual in crisis, we really want to be aware of our paraverbal communication to help de-escalate the situation instead of escalate the situation. So the tone that we want to use is a caring and supportive tone, right? So that's that quality and pitch of what we're saying. The volume, we want that to be appropriate for the situation. Obviously, if we're inside, we're not going to be yelling. And if we're in a place with a lot of noise, we're not going to be whispering. But we want to use a volume that's appropriate to the situation to try to de-escalate. Again, our goal here is to de-escalate an escalating behavior. And then the cadence is the rate and rhythm of speech. And when we are dealing with an individual in crisis, we want to make sure that we're using a more even cadence. So we're not speaking too quickly, we're not speaking too slowly. Another thing to keep in mind that I want to talk about now is those precipitating factors, which are factors that influence behavior, and they may not always be visible or obvious to us. But this is any factor that may influence an individual's behavior. They could be internal, they could be external, and they may lead to behavior. So knowing these allows us to understand why these behaviors might be happening, why this individual may be in crisis. And being aware of precipitating factors also helps us to not become one, which is also really important. Because if we know that there's a student that has the potential to escalate into a crisis situation, if we know what sets them off, then we can try to avoid being one of these precipitating factors. Obviously, we can't always account for them. We can't always control them. But knowing that behaviors happen for a reason that is not necessarily about us will help us to de-escalate that situation and not take it personally, which I'll get into a little bit later too. But as you see, I just have some examples here of precipitating factors. It could be a medication-related issue. The students might be tired. They may not have gotten enough sleep. They might have a second job. For those older kids, they might be working late. They may not understand the work. They might want access to something. I mean, really, precipitating factors are so varied and depend on the individual, and what's a precipitating factor for one individual may not be for another. But that's why it's important to get to know our students so that we learn to understand what might set them off and what might influence their behavior so that we can better help them. So this leads to the notion of detachment, or as they call it in CPI, is that rational detachment, which is knowing how to manage your own behavior and knowing how to not take other people's behaviors personally. So this is really difficult, but it does get easier with practice. If you understand how to kind of remove yourself and detach yourself and understand that, an individual's behavior is not necessarily about you, it's about all these precipitating factors, it's something that happened, then you are better equipped to handle it without an emotional response. So again, just remember, it's not necessarily about you. Don't take it personally, and it'll be a lot easier to handle the situation. Managing your own behavior means knowing how to take care of yourself too. If you practice good self-care, it'll be a lot easier to manage yourself, manage your own emotional reactions. So I just have some examples there. I don't know how you all like to rationally detach and manage your behavior, whether that's exercising, reading, taking a bath, cooking, going for a walk, yoga, whatever it is that helps you manage yourself. Do it and practice it because it will make handling these situations a lot easier for you. This integrated experience is the notion that behavior affects behavior for everybody. So a student's behavior affects staff behavior, as staff behavior affects student behavior. So if you think back to that crisis development model, knowing those levels and knowing how to recognize where those students are will affect how we react. If we see a student that's in an anxiety level, now we know that we need to be supportive. Without knowing that, maybe we'd see a student in an anxiety level and we would be directive and start setting limits, and we may escalate the situation. The behavior is the same, but it's affected the way that we handle it. And by affecting that, we can either escalate or de-escalate a situation. So it's knowing, how does our behavior affect a student, and how does a student affect our behavior? All right, so real quick, I want you to think about the perfect student. Some of you have seen this already, but I think it outlines this whole notion well. So perfect student, I have some examples there of things that I've been told and that people have said as I've done these trainings. So, that perfect student might be respectful, they might be kind, they might be helpful, compassionate, a good leader. Insert whatever word you want in there, whatever you think that perfect student would be in a perfect world, okay? And now I want you to look at this list, and what if I change this? And now we make it the perfect staff. We've got all the same words there. What this serves to do is to make you think about how your behavior affects your students' behaviors. If we are constantly emulating the things that we want to see from our students, that is likely what we'll get back. So again, we have control over our behavior. We don't have control over the student's behavior, but we can control how we react to either escalate or de-escalate a situation. This is just a little meme. To just remind you to drop that rope. You don't have to take things personally. That is in your control. I say this to staff a lot. I say it to myself a lot. I remind myself, Q-tip, quit taking it personally. It really, really helps in de-escalating a situation. So again, important to understand your own limits. It's okay to tap out. It's okay to ask for help. But again, if you manage your behavior and you know your limits, you know where you're saying, I can't handle this right now. I can't detach myself right now. I need to tap out. Asking for help is going to be way better than responding emotionally and maybe overreacting and escalating a situation. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about communication and the importance of communication in de-escalating a crisis. This is that therapeutic rapport stage. Once we see that individual is in tension reduction, and it is one of the most important stages that often gets overlooked. Once the kids calm down, we tend to say, okay, you're good, all right, go back to class, or let's move on with the day, and we forget to build that therapeutic rapport and really listen. And it can be very valuable in helping prevent future occurrences of a crisis, and also just rebuilding that relationship. So in communicating, in rebuilding this therapeutic rapport, we want to make sure that we're giving the student our undivided attention. So that doesn't just mean saying, yep, I'm listening, go ahead. It really means like giving them your full attention, looking at them, keeping in mind that body language, using that open body language. This really helps students feel validated, helps them feel important. We want to also be non-judgmental. Sometimes students do feel shame for the way that they reacted or behaved. So it is important to be non-judgmental. Now is not the time to tell them they were wrong. We want to try to remain impartial, try to remain neutral, and, wait until you can be non-judgmental to talk to the student. If you're still feeling very emotional, now is probably not a good time to talk to the student. If you can't be non-judgmental at the time, I would wait until you could. We want to focus on feelings. One of the strategies that I find very effective, at least at the elementary level, is asking students to hear their side of the story, how they were feeling, what was happening, and just so that they feel heard. And focusing on their feelings also helps them feel validated and understood. This is a good point to clarify and restate to make sure that you're understanding really what happened. Also, silence is great. So silence is golden. It's okay to allow some time, to allow some processing time. Sometimes students that have gone through this whole crisis situation may have a hard time really putting into words how they're feeling or why they reacted that way. So sometimes asking a question and giving processing time is great. And it's difficult because it's unnatural for us to sit in that silence, but sometimes that is all they need. And sometimes kids just need you to sit there with them in silence, and that's okay. And finally, this is a good time to make a plan. Once you've gone through everything and talked to them about how they were feeling, about their side, about what set them off, this is a good time to make a plan and try to figure out, okay, what happened this time? What do you think we could do differently next time? What was missed? Where could that have been de-escalated faster maybe? Maybe the students need to learn how to ask to take a walk or ask for a break. Maybe you can develop a signal with a student to for them to let you know that they need something, and you can jump in at that point. But it's a good time to debrief. Let the student explain what they need, or let them explain what they might need from you. It's a good time to have that back and forth communication and just figure out, what went wrong, what happened, and how can we prevent it from happening in the future. And so what I want to leave you with is this thought that an escalated adult cannot de-escalate an escalated child. So hopefully in watching this video, you either were reminded of some tips or you learned some new strategies in handling a situation. The goal here is to try to de-escalate a crisis situation. And in order to do that, we as adults cannot be escalated. So I hope that this video was informative for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you.